The film opens in with a TV show where three people say they're the famous Frank William Abagnale. He did many tricks like pretending to be a pilot, lawyer, and doctor, and tricked people out of a lot of money in many countries before he was even 19. They ask Frank who caught him, and he tells them it was Carl Henratty. Then, in 1969 in a little town in France, an FBI agent specializing in financial fraud, Carl Henratty, arrives at a prison to see an untidy prisoner with long hair and a beard. This is Frank Abagnale Jr., the man who has been stuck in Carl's head for the last few years. Frank is being kept in horrible conditions and terribly sick, so Carl requests for Frank's extradition and manages to get him out of there and into a US prison. On their way, Carl says he only has a question for Frank. The agent asks Frank how he managed to get his degree as a lawyer. We go 6 years back in the past when Frank is a little 16-year-old boy and lives happily with his parents Frank and Paula in an enormous house. However, Frank's father gets involved in lots of debt due to banks refusing to give him a loan, using as an excuse an apparent tax evasion. As a result, the whole family is forced to move and live a life without any luxury, and up to this point, problems arise. Paula has an affair with a friend of her husband, but Frank knows about it. To the boy's misfortune, his mother makes him promise not to tell anything to his father, who is still struggling to get rid of his problem with taxes and debts. At school, some bullies try to intimidate Frank, pushing him, which makes him drop his books. However, Frank is a smart boy and he starts to develop the art of lying. Once in the classroom, Frank pretends to be the new French professor. As his mother is French, he has a wide language knowledge. The guy who previously harassed him is in the lesson, distraught because he does believe Frank is his teacher. Of course, Frank takes advantage of the citation and ridiculizes him in front of the whole class. Applying this lying method, Frank manages to keep on teaching and pretending to be the substitute professor for many more weeks. Unluckily, problems between his parents get worse as time passes, so they end up getting divorced. This is something truly tough for Frank because his mother and father make him decide who he wants to live with. The boy can't choose one or the other, so, overwhelmed, he decides to run away and make a living on his own. With the help of his checkbook, he conned his way into housing and transport. Nevertheless, he soon runs out of money, and due to the need of surviving he becomes slick, something that will bring him lots of trouble in the future. One day he finds himself in an airport and realizes that pilots have VIP treatment and recognition. In an attempt to benefit from that, he designs a plan to become a pilot. Frank pretends to be a journalist and, deceiving some staff members, he manages to get an interview with the manager of Pan Am, one of the most important airlines of that time. By doing that, Frank gathers valuable information about the pilots. Then, he has a pilot suit made, and in addition to his conviction skills, he succeeds not only in pretending to be a pilot but also managing to successfully cash the checks from the airline at many New York banks and hotels. Even a bank manager who rejected him earlier falls for the trick. Later, at an airport, Frank tries the check scam again but gets mixed up with an expected pilot. Frank has no alternative but to adapt and has his first flight. On that same flight, he also has his first sexual experience with a flight attendant. In Miami, Frank openly flirts with a bank teller and learns about check cashing. He buys a check coding machine at an auction. This helps him in his schemes to write larger checks for larger amounts. This forgery operation draws the attention of Agent Carl. As Frank has handed out hundreds of bad checks and defrauded many states, Carl tries to find the responsible and begins his hunting. After some research, Carl manages to find the location where the scammer is being hosted. Carl arrives at the place and meets Frank. However, Carl is not aware of who this boy is. He doesn't know his face or age. Frank realizes it, so when Carl introduces himself as an agent, the boy manages to impersonate another agent named Barry Allen and makes Carl believe that he is also behind the scammer. Using his deceiving abilities, Frank leaves the room but he forgets his wallet. Carl inspects it and learns that Frank has lied to his face. Without a second thought, Carl rushes after the scammer but he fails. Frank has vanished like a ghost. After the encounter, the contents of the room and Carl's report yield no clues, and the fingerprints taken from the scene prove to be a dead end. Then, Frank has another interview with Pan Am executives where he reveals a series of nicknames he's acquired, including the Skywayman and the 007 of the skies. Empowered by these labels, Frank buys a suit reminiscent of Bond's style and an Aston Martin car. Shortly after, he meets Cheryl Ann, a model featured in a magazine, at the hotel where he's staying. She suggests they spend the night together for $1,000, but Frank claims he only has a check for $1,400. Cheryl suggests an alternative. If he'll give her the check, she'll give him $400 in cash. In this twist of events, Cheryl is in fact paying Frank to spend the night with her. Later, we see Frank trying to mend the relationship between his divorced parents using the stolen money. He takes his father out to a fancy expensive restaurant and gives him the keys to a luxurious Cadillac. But his father declines the gift, claiming that Internal Revenue Service will go after him and his wife Paula has already refused to get involved with him. Several months later, on Christmas Eve, Carl finds himself alone in the FBI office when Frank unexpectedly calls to apologize for their hotel ruse. Unimpressed by the apology, Carl challenges Frank to a face-to-face meeting. Although Frank reveals his location and room number, Carl remains skeptical. As their conversation progresses, Carl realizes the true motive behind the call: Frank's loneliness. Their exchange escalates, culminating in Frank's frustrated hang-up. firing Carl's determination to continue the investigation. Carl knows the face of the imposter and is determined to catch him. The agent conducts a thorough investigation but finds out very little about the man. Fortunately, he learns that the name Barry Allen comes from the comic book of the superhero The Flash. Although this information was found by chance, it is extremely useful because now he knows that the imposter is none other than a young teenager. It also explains why they have been unable to find any record of him or match him through fingerprints. However, Carl remembers that Frank has made a reference to the New York Yankees during the phone conversation, so he instructs his team to investigate missing people cases in the New York area. To his luck, this search leads them to Frank's mother, who is now married to Jack Barnes. Once inside, Carl sees Frank's yearbook photo, and he instantly recognizes him. After that, Carl reveals to Paula that her son forged $1.3 million in checks. Later, while visiting a friend in an Atlanta hospital, Frank meets a nurse named Brenda Strong. He pretends to be a doctor with fake Harvard credentials and a fake work history to get into the hospital. He becomes the night administrator in the emergency room and adds Brenda to his team. Despite his lack of medical skills, Frank motivates his interns to make medical decisions and handles administrative tasks himself. He wins Brenda's heart and they fall in love. When Frank learns that her family disowned her after an abortion, he offers to help her reconnect with them. Meanwhile, Carl goes to see Frank's father, hoping to learn more about where the imposter might be. Frank Sr. refuses to divulge any details about his son. Nevertheless, Carl discovers a letter from Frank that contains an address in Atlanta. Following the address, Carl and his team arrive at Frank's house, but he's already on his way to Louisiana to meet Brenda's parents. Inside the house, Carl discovers Frank's Harvard diploma, which reveals a new name that leads him to the hospital. However, Frank has already left his job there. Back to Frank and Brenda, they travel to Louisiana to meet her parents. During the visit, Frank knows that Brenda's family has a Lutheran faith. In an attempt to get along with Brenda's parents, Frank not only pretends to share their Lutheran faith but also claims to be qualified as a lawyer and a doctor. Brenda's father, Roger, questions Frank about his intentions. Frank feels anxious and he thinks he is being caught, which leads him to confess that he is none of these things, not a lawyer, not a doctor, and not a co-pilot. However, Roger interprets this as a declaration that comes from Frank's heart and agrees to the marriage. Frank manages to pass the bar and becomes an assistant attorney in Roger's law firm. As the wedding preparations continue, Frank returns to New York to inform his father of the engagement. When arriving, Frank knows that his father is now working for the U.S. Post Office and still dealing with IRS issues. Frank is cheerful to announce that he is getting married, but his father reveals that Frank's mother has remarried and moved on, which deeply affects Frank. He also reveals that he has had a visit from the FBI and their knowledge of Frank's actions. At that moment, Frank begs his father to tell him to stop, but instead, Frank Sr. ironically urges him to continue. Frustrated by his father's lack of paternal guidance, Frank breaks up with him. On Christmas Eve, Carl gets a phone call at his FBI office. It is Frank, something that the agent has anticipated. In the conversation, Frank expresses a desire for a settled life and begs Carl to cease the pursuit. However, Carl claims that this isn't feasible, considering Frank has stolen the amount of about $4 million. Frank comprehends and hangs up, but he mentions his engagement without realizing that's valuable information for the agent. As Carl has previously discovered Frank's alias in Atlanta, he deduces that Frank must retain the same name in Louisiana due to his relationship, in order to avoid any suspicion. After looking through wedding announcements, Carl and his team locate Frank and burst in during the engagement party. Frank admits his true identity to Brenda before fleeing through a window, arranging a rendezvous at the local airport. However, when Brenda arrives at the meeting, she only finds herself closely monitored by undercover FBI agents. She realizes that Frank knew about everything, which disappoints and hurts Brenda so badly. As Frank fails to appear, Carl stations his team at the airport, certain that Frank will attempt a show of defiance and seek escape in a plane rather than a low-key departure. Frank develops a new, fresh strategy which involves impersonating a Pan Am Airlines recruiter. Frank visits a nearby college to recruit stewardesses for European flights. He holds auditions, selects only attractive candidates, and dresses them in uniforms. Back at the airport, he strategically moves through the crowd, using the girls as a captivating barrier to distract the agents and draw their attention away from him. In this way, Frank effortlessly slips past Carl's team, makes his way out, and escapes to Europe. He also uses a decoy in the unloading area to further confuse Carl. Time passes, and 7 months later, in 1967, Carl warns his boss that Frank has been forging checks in Europe. This time, however, the checks are the real thing and the situation has nothing to do with Carl's desire to catch the imposter. Carl asks for permission to track Frank down, claiming that he has completely lost control. However, his boss denies Carl's request, claiming that if he couldn't catch the kid in the United States, there's no point in going to Europe because he won't catch him there. As determined as always, Carl refuses to give up and designs a plan. The agent has one of Frank's fake checks analyzed by a professional printer. Due to the quality of the check, the professional deduces that must have been printed using a rare machine which can only be found in a few countries of Europe, including France. At that precise moment, Carl remembers that Frank's mother was French, so, without a second thought, Carl instantly travels to Montrichard, Paula's birthplace. Once there, Carl finds Frank surrounded by lots of machines in an old huge printing factory while printing an endless number of checks. Carl tells Frank that the French police are there with him and that he has promised them to arrest him with his own hands. Frank suspects that Carl is playing mind games with him, but Carl convinces Frank that leaving the factory without him would result in a gunshot. Reluctantly, Frank agrees to be handcuffed, and Carl leads him outside. Observing the absence of law enforcement, Frank admires Carl's skill in deceiving him. Their moment is brief, however, as the French police promptly appear and escort Frank to jail. In the end, Carl promises to arrange for Frank's return to the US through extradition. After being released from prison after 2 years under Carl's supervision, Frank returns to the United States on a plane in 1969, just before Christmas. As they prepare to land, Carl tells Frank that his father had an accident and died the previous year, which destroys Frank. Devastated, Frank manages to lock himself in the bathroom of the plane and escapes when they land, trying to find out where his mother now lives. However, he discovers that his mother has a new family, including a husband and a little daughter who is his half-sister. Realizing that his father is gone and his mother has moved on, Frank gives up and surrenders to Carl and the police who arrive before his mother's new family realizes who Frank is. Frank is eventually tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 12 years in solitary confinement in a maximum security federal prison in Atlanta. Over the next 4 years, Carl visits Frank regularly, especially at Christmas, probably because they both share a sense of loneliness during the season. During one of these visits, Frank effortlessly identifies a counterfeiter Carl is pursuing by simply glancing at a check Carl casually displays. This observation gives the FBI agent an idea. A few visits later, Carl returns with his supervisor. When Frank is presented with a check, he quickly recognizes it as a forgery the moment he touches it, which brings a smile to Carl's face. In 1974, Carl arranges for Frank to serve the remainder of his sentence under FBI supervision, working in the check fraud department. Although he is no longer in prison, Frank is confined to a desk and misses the excitement of his past. When he accidentally spots a pilot's uniform, the temptation to impersonate an airline pilot returns. Just as he's about to take off, Carl intercepts him at the airport. Disappointed, Carl decides to let him go and tells him he is sure he will be back on Monday. Surprised, Frank asks how he knows that he will do that, to which Carl replies that no one is chasing him and leaves. When Monday morning arrives, Carl becomes anxious when Frank fails to show up for work on time. But Frank eventually appears, and they delve into a recently uncovered check forgery case using new and unfamiliar techniques. While examining the check, Carl finally brings up a question that has lingered for years: how Frank managed to pass the Louisiana bar exam and become a lawyer. Frank claims that he didn't cheat, that he studied hard for 2 weeks, and that he succeeded on his own merits. Although Carl asks for confirmation, Frank prefers to focus on the case at hand. In the ending scene, we learn that Frank has enjoyed a joyful marriage of 26 years, has raised 3 sons, and resides with his family in the Midwest. Besides, Carl and he remain as close friends. What is even more, Frank has apprehended some of the world's most elusive counterfeiters, and receives a substantial annual income for his contribution to the creation of unforgeable checks.